Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. I debated whether to split this book into two episodes. Ultimately, I decided that I will, because there's a lot of really good and interesting stuff in here, and I didn't really want to cut it too short. A lot of stuff that I want to address in this. It is an essentially pragmatic examination of religion. As we know from previous episodes, William James was very interested in religion. It's sort of could be considered sort of instrumentalist in the sense that he looks at religion more in regards to how it affects people's lives to be or not be religious than he does in discussing the actual truth of any religious conceptions. And in discussing the varieties of religious experience, he's really not like going through some sort of litany of the various different religions on Earth and examining each of these religions in turn. What he's really doing is looking at the dispositions of religious people. And he really boils it down to essentially two dispositions, I suppose three, as I'll discuss as I get into the book. But he's not talking about religions per se, but as ways of approaching the world that involve religion or religious sentiments, or involve sentiments that could be described as quasi-religious even. So I am going to split it into two episodes. This first episode is going to cover lectures. This will cover lectures 1 through 7, and then lectures 8 through 20 will be covered in the next episode. So this episode will be the one that introduces the concepts of healthy-mindedness and the sick soul, which are very important concepts in this book and important to James's overall philosophy. So like all my episodes, I'll be reading some sections and discussing a little bit of what I've read. So without an awful lot of introductory blather, let me go ahead and start reading a little bit here from Lecture 3, The Reality of the Unseen. He talks about abstractions. And he says, quote, "As time, space, and the ether soak through all things, so we feel do abstract and essential goodness, beauty, strength, significance, justice, soak through all things good, strong, significant, and just. Such ideas, and others equally abstract, form the background for all our facts, the fountainhead of all the possibilities we conceive of. They give its nature, as we call it, to every special thing. Everything we know is what it is by sharing in the nature of one of these abstractions. We can never look directly at them, for they are bodiless and featureless and footless, but we grasp all other things by their means. And in handling the real world, we should be stricken with helplessness, in just so far forth as we might lose these mental objects, these adjectives and adverbs and predicates, and heads of classification and conception. This absolute determinability of our minds by abstractions is one of the cardinal facts of our human constitution. Polarizing and magnetizing us as they do, we turn towards them and from them, we seek them, hold them, hate them, bless them, just as if they were so many concrete beings. And beings that they are, beings as real in the realm which they inhabit as the changing things of sense are in the realm of space. Plato gave so brilliant and impressive a defense of this common human feeling that the doctrine of the reality of abstract objects has been known as the Platonic theory of ideas ever since. Abstract beauty, for example, is for Plato a perfectly definite individual being, of which the intellect is aware as of something additional to all the perishing beauties of the earth. The true order of going, he says, in the often quoted passage in his Banquet, is to use the beauties of earth as steps, along which one mounts upwards for the sake of that other beauty, going from one to two, and from two to all fair forms, and from fair forms to fair actions, and from fair actions to fair notions, until from fair notions he arrives at the notion of absolute beauty, and at last knows what the essence of beauty is. In our last lecture, we had a glimpse of the way in which a Platonizing writer like Emerson may treat the abstract divineness of things, the moral structure of the universe, as a fact worthy of worship. In those various churches without a God, which today are spreading through the world under the name of ethical societies, we have a similar worship of the abstract divine, the moral law, believed in as an ultimate object. Science, in many minds, is genuinely taking the place of a religion. Where this is so, the scientist treats the laws of nature as objective facts to be revered. A brilliant school of interpretation of Greek mythology would have it that in their origin the Greek gods were only half metaphoric personifications of those great spheres of abstract law and order into which the natural world falls apart: the sky sphere, the ocean sphere, the earth sphere, and the like. Just as even now we may speak of the smile of the morning, the kiss of the breeze, or the bite of the cold, without really meaning that these phenomena of nature actually wear a human face. As regards the origin of the Greek gods, we need not at present seek an opinion, but the whole array of our instances leads to a conclusion something like this. It is as if there were in the human consciousness a sense of reality, a feeling of objective presence, a perception of what we may call something there, more deep and more general than any of the special and particular senses by which the current psychology supposes existent realities to be originally revealed. If this were so, we might suppose the senses to waken our attitudes and conduct, as they so habitually do, by first exciting this sense of reality. But anything else, any idea, for example, that might similarly excite it, it would have that same prerogative of appearing real, which objects of sense normally possess. So far as religious conceptions were able to touch this reality feeling, they would be believed in spite of criticism, even though they might be so vague and remote as to be almost unimaginable. End quote. So this is interesting. It ties back sort of to some of the things I talked about when I was looking at Plato, with the idea of the Platonic forms being sort of behaviors, sort of classifications of activities, sort of ideological ideas, perhaps mental archetypes, abstract ideas, and divine beings and gods. So he does talk about the Greek mythology, and he talks about Plato, and they're somewhat similar, although Plato doesn't really as explicitly make gods of things like beauty and good. Plato begins to step away a little bit from the mythologizing of the ancient Greek world, but he doesn't step too far away when he considers the things like beauty as having some sort of transcendent reality, and that all beautiful things share in this transcendent form that is not necessarily of the world, but resides in another realm, so to speak, of Platonic forms and archetypal ideas. And of course, one wonders whether we're really talking about the shapes of reality, or whether we're talking about divine beings, or whether we're talking about different components of the human subconscious mind, whether we're talking about the framework that we use to assemble our concepts of reality. And he talks about a sense of reality, and that almost sounds a little bit like common sense philosophy, common sense realism, that we just have this sense within us, a feeling of reality, and that things like justice and beauty awaken this sort of inner sense of reality. He says, so far as religious conceptions were able to touch this reality feeling, they would be believed in spite of criticism, even though they might be so vague and remote as to be almost unimaginable. So these sorts of concepts, archetypes, touch on a sense of reality or realism, a sense of presence, even though it's not the sort of thing that we can necessarily pin down through our regular five senses. So that's pretty interesting how he does sort of take a Platonic approach, and I generally am skeptical about Platonism because I don't think that, Plato really posits that there's a transcendent realm of forms, and I'm myself quite a bit of a strict materialist, but I do think these forms, these archetypes, if you will, really are the components, the inner structure of our subconscious mind. It's neurological. These are neurological concepts that we've evolved to have because having them has helped us make our way in the world. That's really what I believe. And he talks a little bit about the subconscious in here in this next section. Although this was written quite a long time ago, this was published in 1902, so you're looking at like before Carl Jung and maybe in the earliest stages when Freud was writing. This is at the earliest point of psychoanalysis when he's writing this, but he does touch on some of those things when he says, quote, "I spoke of the convincingness of these feelings of reality, and I must dwell a moment longer on that point. They are as convincing to those who have them as any direct sensible experiences can be, and they are, as a rule, much more convincing than results established by mere logic ever are. One may indeed be entirely without them. Probably more than one of you here present is without them in any marked degree, but if you do have them, and have them at all strongly, the probability is that you cannot help regarding them as genuine perceptions of truth, as revelations of a kind of reality, which no adverse argument, however unanswerable by you in words, can expel from your belief. The opinion opposed to mysticism in philosophy is sometimes spoken of as rationalism. Rationalism insists that all our beliefs ought ultimately to find for themselves articulate grounds. Such grounds for rationalism must consist of 4 things. 1. Definitely statable abstract principles. 2. Definite facts of sensation. 3. Definite hypotheses based on such facts. And 4. Definite inferences logically drawn. Vague impressions of something indefinable have no place in the rationalistic system, which on its positive side is surely a splendid intellectual tendency, for not only are all our philosophical fruits of it, but physical science, amongst other good things, is its result. Nevertheless, if we look on man's whole mental life as it exists, on the life of men that lies in them apart from their learning and science, and that they inwardly and privately follow, we have to confess that the part of it of which rationalism can give an account is relatively superficial. It is the part that has the prestige, undoubtedly, for it has the loquacity, it can challenge you for proofs and chop logic and put you down with words, but it will fail to convince or convert you all the same, if your dumb intuitions are opposed to its conclusions. If you have intuitions at all, they come from a deeper level of your nature than the loquacious level which rationalism inhabits. Your whole subconscious life, your impulses, your faiths, your needs, your divinations, have prepared the premises of which your consciousness now feels the weight of the result. And something in you absolutely knows that that result must be truer than any logic-chopping rationalistic talk, however clever, that may contradict it. This inferiority of the rationalistic level in founding belief is just as manifest when rationalism argues for religion as when it argues against it. That vast literature of proofs of God's existence, drawn from the order of nature which a century ago seemed so overwhelmingly convincing, today does little more than gather dust in libraries, for the simple reason that our generation has ceased to believe in the kind of God it argued for. Whatever sort of a being God may be, we know today that he is never more that mere external inventor of contrivances intended to make manifest his glory, in which our great-grandfathers took such satisfaction. Though just how we know this we cannot possibly make clear by words, either to others or to ourselves. I defy any of you here fully to account for your persuasion that if a God exists, he must be a more cosmic and tragic personage than that being. The truth is that in the metaphysical and religious sphere, articulate reasons are cogent for us only when our inarticulate feelings of reality have already been impressed in favor of the same conclusion. Then, indeed, our intuitions and our reason work together, and great world-ruling systems, like that of the Buddhist or of the Catholic philosophy, may grow up. Our impulsive belief is here always what sets up the original body of truth, and our articulately verbalized philosophy is but its showy translation into formulas. The unreasoned and immediate assurance is the deep thing in us. The reasoned argument is but a surface exhibition. Instinct leads, intelligence does but follow. If a person feels the presence of a living God, after the fashion shown by my quotations, your critical arguments, be they never so superior, will vainly set themselves to change his faith. Please observe, however, that I do not yet say that it is better that the subconscious and non-rational should thus hold primacy in the religious realm, I confine myself to simply pointing out that they do so hold it as a matter of fact." End quote. So here we get the classic formulation that I've touched on in a few of books previously, a few of James's books and others, of the importance of the intuition and the inner sensation and the inner beliefs and the unexplainable inner passions over the intellectual justification of our beliefs. We don't really believe things, particularly when it comes to the deepest and most moving aspects of reality, necessarily because it's been explained to us a certain way. We first feel intuitions, and then we explain, using logic and rationalism, systems of justification for those inner intuitions, upon which our beliefs are fundamentally built. Now, I'm not so sure that that's completely true, although I definitely think there's truth to that, but I know there have been a few things about which I've changed my mind, and I wonder the extent to which good argument that I was unable to refute was an important point of that changing of my mind. I think there does come a point when your inner beliefs simply cannot withstand the onslaught of rational argument, and you have to change your belief. The rational argument sounds true, and yet it conflicts with your inner belief. It's not so easy as James describes to just brush off the rational argument and say, well, I believe, I feel this to be true, therefore it's true, and I'm not going to change my belief just because of your rock-solid logic. I don't think it's quite so easy, and sometimes we have to wrestle with an argument that sounds right and makes sense to us, and we have to sort of judge the strength of the argument against the validity of our own intuitions. And we have to sometimes realize that our intuitions aren't always correct. Sometimes we feel something to be true. Sometimes we feel something to be true very deeply. And lo and behold, it wasn't true. This happens sometimes with relationships. You are in love with someone and you feel deeply in your bones that the person that you're in love with is also in love with you. And then you find out that they're not in love with you the same way that you are with them. And despite whatever you felt, you might feel that you and someone else are meant to be together or destined to be together, and lo and behold, you're not. That's a sort of an important dramatic thing, but other things sometimes. One time, for example, I was certain that my car had been stolen because it wasn't where I had parked it. Now, this sounds kind of simple, but I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt. My car had been stolen because I had parked it right there, and I just knew, and it wasn't. Of course, I parked it somewhere else. That's sort of more of a trivial example, but it kind of shook me a little bit to be so certain of something and then to be wrong. Sometimes you can believe a thing to be true and then come to find out that you were wrong the whole time. And a little bit of humility is necessary, right? Sometimes your intuitions, your inner feelings, your passions, they might lead you to a conclusion, and you might use your logic to build up the justification for why you believe something to be true. But you ought to have some amount of skepticism to know that you're not infallible, your intuitions are not infallible, your innermost beliefs are not themselves infallible, and sometimes you're just wrong. So I think that rationality is given a bit of a short shrift here, and arguments and logic do, in fact, play a part in what we believe. So let me jump forward from there to where he begins to talk about healthy-mindedness. And this is one of the core concepts in this book. And he says, quote, "If we give the name of healthy-mindedness to the tendency which looks on all things and sees that they are good, we find that we must distinguish between a more involuntary and a more voluntary or systematic way of being healthy-minded. In its involuntary variety, healthy-mindedness is a way of feeling happy about things immediately. In its systematical variety, it is an abstract way of conceiving things as good. Every abstract way of conceiving things selects some one aspect of them as their essence for the time being and disregards the other aspects. Systematic healthy-mindedness, conceiving good as the essential and universal aspect of being, deliberately excludes evil from its field of vision. And although, when thus nakedly stated, this might seem a difficult feat to perform, For one who is intellectually sincere with himself and honest about facts, a little reflection shows that the situation is too complex to lie open to so simple a criticism. In the first place, happiness, like every other emotional state, has blindness and insensibility to opposing facts given it as its instinctive weapon for self-protection against disturbance. When happiness is actually in possession, the thought of evil can no more acquire the feeling of reality than the thought of good can gain reality when melancholy rolls. To the man actively happy, from whatever cause, evil simply cannot then and there be believed in. He must ignore it. And to the bystander, he may then seem perversely to shut his eyes to it and hush it up. But more than this, the hushing of it may, in a perfectly candid and honest mind, grow into a deliberate religious policy. Much of what we call evil is due entirely to the way men take the phenomena. It can so often be converted into a bracing and tonic good by a simple change of the sufferer's inner attitude from one of fear to one of fight. Its sting so often departs and turns into a relish when, after vainly seeking to shun it, we agree to face about and bear it cheerfully. That a man is simply bound in honor, with reference to many of the facts that seem at first to disconcert his peace, to adopt this way of escape. Refuse to admit their badness, despise their power, ignore their presence, turn your attention the other way, and so far as you yourself are concerned at any rate, though the facts may still exist, their evil character exists no longer. Since you make them evil or good by your own thoughts about them, it is the ruling of your thoughts which proves to be your principal concern. The deliberate adoption of an optimistic turn of mind thus makes its entrance into philosophy. And once in, it is hard to trace its lawful bounds. Not only does the human instinct for happiness, bent on self-protection by ignoring, keep working in its favor, but higher inner ideals have weighty words to say. The attitude of unhappiness is not only painful, it is mean and ugly. What can be more base and unworthy than the pining, puling, mumping mood, no matter by what outward ills it may have been engendered? What is more injurious to others? What less helpful as a way out of the difficulty? It but fastens and perpetuates the trouble which occasioned it, and increases the total evil of the situation. At all costs, then, we ought to reduce the sway of that mood. We ought to scout it in ourselves and others and never show it tolerance. But it is impossible to carry on this discipline in the subjective sphere without zealously emphasizing the brighter and minimizing the darker aspects of the objective sphere of things at the same time. And thus our resolution not to indulge in misery, beginning at a comparatively small point within ourselves, may not stop until it has brought the entire frame of reality under a systematic conception optimistic enough to be congenial with all its needs. In all this I say nothing of any mystical insight or persuasion that the total frame of things absolutely must be good. Such mystical persuasion plays an enormous part in the history of the religious consciousness, and we must look at it later with some care. But we need not go so far at present. More ordinary, non-mystical conditions of rapture suffice for my immediate contention. All invasive moral states and passionate enthusiasms make one feelingless to evil in some direction. The common penalties cease to deter the patriot. The usual prudences are flung by the lover to the winds. When the passion is extreme, suffering may actually be gloried in, provided it be for the ideal cause. Death may lose its sting, the grave its victory. In these states, the ordinary contrast of good and ill seems to be swallowed up in a higher denomination, an omnipotent excitement which engulfs the evil, and which the human being welcomes as the crowning experience of his life. This, he says, is truly to live, and I exult in the heroic opportunity and adventure. The systematic cultivation of healthy-mindedness as a religious attitude is therefore consonant with important currents in human nature, and is anything but absurd. In fact, we all do cultivate it more or less, even when our professed theology should inconsistency forbid it. We divert our attention from disease and death as much as we can, and the slaughterhouses and indecencies without end on which our life is founded are huddled out of sight and never mentioned, so that the world we recognize officially in literature and in society is a poetic fiction, far handsomer and cleaner and better than the world that really is." End quote. So here you have the basic introduction to healthy-mindedness, and he says there's two types. The first is sort of instinctive healthy-mindedness, which is really He says, in its involuntary variety, healthy-mindedness is a way of feeling happy about things immediately. And that's pretty much all he says about the instinctive healthy-mindedness. It's just a disposition to, based on someone's, perhaps their just instinctive way of being, their constitution. They just tend to be cheerful in life. They tend not to dwell on the dark side all the time. They've got a smile on their face. They've got a joke at hand. You know people like this. They just have a good attitude about life, and it just comes naturally to them. They tend to be just cheerful people. I know people like this, and it's probably a pretty good way to be. I'm not sure that I'm like that, but you see people like that, and you think they're probably pretty happy with life. Now, obviously, there's always more going on, but if your disposition is to be an optimist, to look on the sunny side of things, you probably enjoy your day more than someone who's always dwelling on the dark side. But he says there's also a more intentional, systematic way of being healthy-minded. And he says, now this might seem foolish to sort of shut your eyes deliberately to all of the dark things in life and force yourself to only focus on the good things. It sort of seems like a deliberate blindness and a sort of intentional foolishness as a way to go about the world, and maybe an inferior way of being. But he says that every emotional state has a sort of blindness, and when you're really happy, you are just blind to bad things. You just naturally, if you're in a good mood, then depressing and dark things aren't allowed any way into your mind. It's just the exact reverse of if you're in a real terrible funk. Good things don't do much for you, right? There's a sort of blindness when you're depressed. Happy things have no weight, and you don't give them any mind. You can't see their happiness. You're in a state of blindness. And the reverse is true, that when you're happy, the sad things don't have weight, and they can't break in to ruin your mood. It's just sort of the nature of moods to be that way, and no matter what your frame of mind is, you're sort of excluding other things that contradict it. And he says actually that having that sort of deliberate good frame of mind is beneficial to you. He says it can be a bracing and tonic good when you turn about to face your problems rather than being intimidated by them, rather than wanting to flee. You turn and want to fight, and you no longer allow them to drag you down. That sometimes, he says, for the patriot, the penalties don't have any sway over his behavior. He's not cognizant of the penalties. And similarly, someone who's in love isn't going to concern themselves so much with prudences and being careful all the time. They might be more bold. And he also says the attitude of unhappiness is not only painful, it's mean and ugly. What can be more base and unworthy than the pining, puling, mumping mood? What is more injurious to others and less helpful as a way out of difficulty? A dark, gloomy rut is not a good place to be in. It's not attractive in other people, and it's not helpful in making our way through the world. To some extent, having an optimistic belief keeps you moving, keeps you going, keeps you motivated to keep striving. If you believe that you can overcome your challenges, you're more likely to overcome them than if you believe that they are oppressive and you will never win. So there's a sort of just benefit in life in being that way, and if you have to force yourself to be that way, then so be it. That's what you need to do in order to thrive. He says we all do it. The dark side of life is just sort of kept at bay so that we can enjoy the world. He says the world we recognize officially in literature and in society is a poetic fiction, far handsomer and cleaner and better than the world that really is. So there is a benefit here to being deliberately healthy-minded. So let's keep moving. He talks a little bit more about liberalism, interestingly, and this doesn't necessarily conform with what we consider liberal in the modern world, but it is an interesting approach here when he says, quote, "The advance of liberalism, so-called, in Christianity during the past 50 years may fairly be called a victory of healthy-mindedness within the church over the morbidness with which the old hellfire theology was more harmoniously related. We have now whole congregations whose preachers, far from magnifying our consciousness of sin, seem devoted rather to making little of it. They ignore or even deny eternal punishment and insist on the dignity rather than on the depravity of man. They look at the continual preoccupation of the old-fashioned Christian with the salvation of his soul as something sickly and reprehensible rather than admirable, and a sanguine and muscular attitude, which to our forefathers would have seemed purely heathen, has become, in their eyes, an ideal element of Christian character. I am not asking whether or not they are right, I am only pointing out the change. The persons to whom I refer have still retained, for the most part, their nominal connection with Christianity, in spite of their discarding of its more pessimistic theological elements. But in that theory of evolution, which, gathering momentum for a century, has within the past 25 years swept so rapidly over Europe and America, we see the ground laid for a new sort of religion, of nature, which has entirely displaced Christianity from the thought of a large part of our generation. The idea of a universal evolution lends itself to a doctrine of general meliorism and progress, which fits the religious needs of the healthy-minded so well that it seems almost as if it might have been created for their use. Accordingly, we find evolutionism interpreted thus optimistically and embraced as a substitute for the religion they were born in, by a multitude of our contemporaries who have either been trained scientifically or been fond of reading popular science, and who had already begun to be inwardly dissatisfied with what seemed to them the harshness and irrationality of the orthodox Christian scheme. End quote. So a couple things mentioned here. The first is a sort of change in Christianity toward liberalism, what he describes as liberalism, but it tends to focus less on the old-fashioned hellfire negative pessimism and focus on the depravity of man, and replaced with a more sanguine, muscular attitude. He says our forefathers would have considered that purely heathen, but that has become an ideal element in the Christian character. And more interestingly, more concerned with the dignity than the depravity of man. But he also says, in the theory of evolution, there has come about a sort of religion of nature which has displaced Christianity from the thought of a large part of our generation. And this is the idea of evolution lends itself to the ideas of progress. Now, really understanding evolution it's not exactly that, there's a sort of progress from a simple state to a complex state, although there certainly can be, or a better state. It's definitely not if you think that we're going to, people will use the word evolution like we're going to evolve into something better than we are now. That evolution is the state of constant improvement and constant betterment. It's really just always more and more closely changing to fit the environment. And insofar as the environment is changing, then an equilibrium is achieved. And it's not always just this onward and upward concept that really rules the evolutionary theory, especially when you consider what progress means to a lot of people who use the term. Evolution is based in inequality, evolution is based in chaos, and it's based in death. And it is driven by failure. Without some entities succeeding and other entities failing, evolution doesn't work. All creatures can't procreate at equal rates. Some are more successful, some are less successful. And that's what drives evolution. And sort of Marxist vision of progress towards some sort of perfect utopian society has nothing to do with evolution. But this is sort of in the somewhat early days of evolutionary theory, and perhaps it was at that time relied upon to provide some sort of foundation for utopianism, that we will evolve toward something better than we are today. That can be a driver of utopian thinking. So let's move forward into the sick soul. Now, in the section on the sick soul, he says, quote, "In contrast with such healthy-minded views as these, if we treat them as a way of deliberately minimizing evil, stands a radically opposite view, a way of maximizing evil, if you please to so call it, based on the persuasion that the evil aspects of our life are of its very essence, and that the world's meaning most comes home to us when we lay them most to heart. We have now to address ourselves to this more morbid way of looking at the situation. But as I closed our last hour with a general philosophical reflection on the healthy-minded way of taking life, I should like at this point to make another philosophical reflection upon it before turning to that heavier task. You will excuse the brief delay. If we admit that evil is an essential part of our being and the key to the interpretation of our life, we load ourselves down with a difficulty that has always proved burdensome in philosophies of religion. Theism, whenever it has erected itself into a systematic philosophy of the universe, has shown a reluctance to let God be anything less than all in all. In other words, philosophic theism has always shown a tendency to become pantheistic and monistic, and to consider the world as one unit of absolute fact. And this has been at variance with popular or practical theism, which latter has ever been more or less frankly pluralistic, not to say polytheistic, and shown itself perfectly well satisfied with the universe composed of many original principles, provided we be only allowed to believe that the divine principle remains supreme, and that the others are subordinate. In this latter case, God is not necessarily responsible for the existence of evil. He would only be responsible if it were not finally overcome. But on the monistic or pantheistic view, evil, like everything else, must have its foundation in God. And the difficulty is to see how this can possibly be the case if God be absolutely good. This difficulty faces us in every form of philosophy in which the world appears as one flawless unit of fact. Such a unit is an individual, and in it the worst parts must be as essential as the best, must be as necessary to make the individual what he is. Since if any part whatever in an individual were to vanish or alter, it would no longer be that individual at all. The philosophy of absolute idealism, so vigorously represented both in Scotland and America today, has to struggle with this difficulty quite as much as scholastic theism struggled in its time. And although it would be premature to say that there is no speculative issue whatever from the puzzle, it is perfectly fair to say that there is no clear or easy issue, and that the only obvious escape from paradox here is to cut loose from the monistic assumption altogether, and to allow the world to have existed from its origin in pluralistic form, as an aggregate or collection of higher and lower things and principles, rather than an absolutely unitary fact. For then, evil would not need to be essential. It might be, and may always have been, an independent portion that had no rational or absolute right to live with the rest, and which we might conceivably hope to see got rid of at last. Now, the gospel of healthy-mindedness, as we have described it, casts its vote distinctly for this pluralistic view, whereas the monistic philosopher finds himself more or less bound to say, as Hegel said, that everything actual is rational, and that evil, as an element dialectically required, must be pinned in and kept and consecrated and have a function awarded to it in the final system of truth. Healthy-mindedness refuses to say anything of the sort. Evil, it says, is emphatically irrational, and not to be pinned in or preserved or consecrated in any final system of truth. It is a pure abomination to the Lord, an alien unreality, a waste element to be sloughed off and negated, and the very memory of it, if possible, wiped out and forgotten. The ideal, so far from being coextensive with the whole actual, is a mere extract from the actual, marked by its deliverance from all contact with this diseased, inferior, and excrementitious stuff. Here we have the interesting notion fairly and squarely presented to us, of there being elements in the universe which may make no rational whole in conjunction with the other elements, and which, from the point of view of any system which those other elements make up, can only be considered so much irrelevance and accident, so much dirt, as it were, and matter out of place. I ask you now not to forget this notion, for although most philosophers seem either to forget it or to disdain it too much ever to mention it, I believe that we shall have to admit it ourselves in the end as containing an element of truth. The mind-cure gospel thus once more appears to us as having dignity and importance. We have seen it to be a genuine religion, and no mere silly appeal to imagination to cure disease. We have seen its method of experimental verification to be not unlike the method of all science. And now here we find mind cure as the champion of a perfectly definite conception of the metaphysical structure of the world." End quote. So just as an aside that he mentions this mind cure, I skipped over the sections. There's more, obviously. There's a lot more in this book that I haven't covered, but there are sections where he talks about something called mind cure, or at least that's what he calls it, which was apparently real popular back in that era, which was maybe the precursor to the whole New Age stuff, which really was about the power of positive thinking. This mind cure concept basically presenting the idea that you can heal yourself with the right frame of mind by putting your mind in the right state. You can affect your body and get rid of ailments and things like that. And he says it sounds like a sort of silly appeal to imagination to cure disease, but he says there's a sort of dignity and importance to having the right frame of mind and the idea. So this is coming back to the pluralism versus monism debate that has sprung up in this podcast from episode to episode periodically between whether the universe is really at its core one or many. And he says that if you view the universe as one, in a sort of monistic / pantheistic way, I'm not sure pantheistic way would require that, but let's say that it does, that everything together, I mean, if pantheism means that everything together is divine and stands in and constitutes what we could consider God, then all of its constituent parts are necessary to it being itself. All of the parts of the universe are necessary for this universe as God to exist as God, and no part of it is undivine, no part of it is to be rejected. But if you want to look at parts of the universe and find that they are unworthy, parts of the universe should be rejected or are of lesser significance or lesser value or lesser divinity than other parts of the universe, you really have to take a more of a pluralistic view that the real divinity is captured in one aspect of reality, and the other aspects are just not, they're not part of the divine component. And that's more of the pluralistic view that says that the universe is many things, and the evil in the world can be separated from the good in the world without any sort of contradiction. And in order to have the mind cure mentality, you have to look at the world in the pluralistic way. You have to look at it as though there's positive and negative ways of thinking, and one of these is clearly superior to the other, and that you're not missing anything by excluding the dark side of the world, right? So while he's talking about the sixth soul, he really hasn't quite broken into it yet. Like, this is the chapter on the sixth soul, but he says, before I get into this, we really need to kind of look at healthy-mindedness one more time. And so we can have a concept here that we can contrast with the sick soul. So in getting a little bit more into the sick soul, he says, quote, "Just as we saw that in healthy-mindedness there are shallower and profounder levels, happiness like that of the mere animal, and more regenerate sorts of happiness, so also are there different levels of the morbid mind, and the one is much more formidable than the other. There are people for whom evil means only a maladjustment with things, a wrong correspondence of one's life with the environment. Such evil as this is curable, in principle at least, upon the natural plane, for merely by modifying either the self or the things, or both at once, the two terms may be made to fit, and all go merry as a marriage bell again. But there are others for whom evil is no mere relation of the subject to particular outer things, but something more radical and general, a wrongness or vice in his essential nature, which no alteration of the environment or any superficial rearrangement of the inner self can cure, and which requires a supernatural remedy. On the whole, the Latin races have leaned more toward the former way of looking upon evil as made up of ills and sins in the plural, removable in detail, while the Germanic races have tended rather to think of sin in the singular, with a capital S, as of something ineradicably ingrained in our natural subjectivity and never to be removed by any superficial piecemeal operations. These comparisons of races are always open to exception, but undoubtedly the northern tone in religion has inclined to the more intimately pessimistic persuasion. In this way of feeling, being the more extreme, we shall find by far the more instructive for our study. Recent psychology has found great use for the word threshold as a symbolic designation for the point at which one state of mind passes into another. Thus, we speak of the threshold of a man's consciousness in general to indicate the amount of noise, pressure, or other outer stimulus which it takes to arouse his attention at all. One with a high threshold will doze through an amount of racket by which one with a low threshold would be immediately waked. Similarly, when one is sensitive to small differences in any order of sensation, we say he has a low difference threshold. His mind easily steps over it into the consciousness of the differences in question. And just so we might speak of a pain threshold, a fear threshold, a misery threshold, and find it quickly overpassed by the consciousness of some individuals, but lying too high in others to be often reached by their consciousness. The sanguine and healthy-minded live habitually on the sunny side of their misery line. The depressed and melancholy live beyond it, in darkness and apprehension. There are men who seem to have started in life with a bottle or two of champagne inscribed to their credit, while others seem to have been born close to the pain threshold, which the slightest irritants fatally send them over. Does it not appear as if one who lived more habitually on one side of the pain threshold might need a different sort of religion from one who habitually lived on the other? This question of the relativity of different types of religion to different types of need arises naturally at this point, and will become a serious problem ere we have done. But before we confront it in general terms, we must address ourselves to the unpleasant task of hearing what the sick souls, as we may call them in contrast to the healthy-minded, have to say of the secrets of their prison house, their own peculiar form of consciousness. Let us then resolutely turn our backs on the once born and their sky-blue optimistic gospel. Let us not simply cry out, in spite of all appearances, "Hurrah for the universe! God's in his heaven! All's right with the world!" Let us see rather whether pity, pain, and fear, and the sentiment of human helplessness may not open a profounder view and put into our hands a more complicated key to the meaning of the situation. End quote. So in the end there he says we're going to look at some testimony from people who are more sick-minded, the sick soul people, to see what they have to say about their state of mind. And that corresponds with an awful lot of this book where he actually recites. Now this book was originally a set of lectures delivered in, I believe, Oxford. Actually, it's the University of Edinburgh. He delivered them in two separate parts. But anyway, the point is that he recites in these lectures and includes in the book a great many recitations of other people's writings, paragraphs upon paragraphs at a time, copying what other people have said about their lives. And so we get direct testimony from the healthy-minded, and we get direct testimony from the sick souls about how they view life and what they've experienced and how their religion affects them. So he goes on at that point to provide some examples of sick souls. I don't really want to get into reading the examples, but it's certainly interesting. But at any rate, let's continue on here with a bit where he talks about how healthy-mindedness simply isn't up to the task of adequately describing reality, where he says, quote, "Life and its negation are beaten up inextricably together. But if the life be good, the negation of it must be bad. Yet the two are equally essential facts of existence, and all natural happiness thus seems infected with a contradiction. The breath of the sepulchre surrounds it. To a mind attentive to this state of things, and rightly subject to the joy-destroying chill which such a contemplation engenders, the only relief that the healthy-mindedness can give is by saying, 'Stuff and nonsense, get out into the open air,' or 'Cheer up, old fellow, you'll be all right ere long if you would only drop your morbidness.' But in all seriousness, how can such bald animal talk as that be treated as a rational answer? To ascribe religious value to mere happy-go-lucky contentment with one's brief chance at natural good is but the very consecration of forgetfulness and superficiality. Our troubles lie indeed too deep for that cure. The fact that we can die, that we can be ill at all, is what perplexes us. The fact that we now, for a moment, live and are well is irrelevant to that perplexity. We need a life not correlated with death, a health not liable to illness, a kind of good that will not perish, a good, in fact, that flies beyond the goods of nature. It all depends on how sensitive the soul may become to discords. "The trouble with me is that I believe too much in common happiness and goodness," said a friend of mine whose consciousness was of this sort, "and nothing can console me for their transiency. I am appalled and disconcerted at its being possible." And so with most of us, a little cooling down of animal excitability and instinct, a little loss of animal toughness, a little irritable weakness and descent to the pain threshold, will bring the worm at the core of all our usual springs of delight into full view, and turn us into melancholy metaphysicians. The pride of life and glory of the world will shrivel. It is, after all, but the standing quarrel of hot youth and hoary eld. Old age has the last word. The purely naturalistic look at life, however enthusiastically it may begin, is sure to end in sadness. This sadness lies at the heart of every merely positivistic, agnostic, or naturalistic scheme of philosophy. Let sanguine healthy-mindedness do its best with its strange power of living in the moment and ignoring and forgetting. Still, the evil background is really there to be thought of, and the skull will grin in at the banquet. In the practical life of the individual, we know how his whole gloom or glee about any present fact depends on the remoter schemes and hopes with which it stands related. Its significance and framing give it the chief part of its value. Let it be known to lead nowhere, and however agreeable it may be in its immediacy, its glow and gilding vanish. The old man, sick with an insidious internal disease, may laugh and quaff his wine at first as well as ever, but he knows his fate now, for the doctors have revealed it. And the knowledge knocks the satisfaction out of all these functions. They are partners of death, and the worm is their brother, and they turn to a mere flatness. End quote. So basically, he's just saying here that the healthy-minded approach, which he interestingly equates with naturalistic philosophy, is inadequate because behind the healthy moment there is always darkness lurking. There's always death around the corner, and most likely a painful death and an unpleasant death. There's always an end. There's a sickness. There's suffering in the world that can't be escaped by not looking at it or seeing it. And he says, to a mind attentive to the state of things, subject to the joy-destroying chill which such contemplation engenders, all that the healthy-minded can say is, "Cheer up, old fellow." He says, how can that really be an adequate answer to the problems of death and suffering in the world? When you really think about it, it's not good enough. He says, our troubles lie too deep for that. The fact that we can be ill, the fact that we will die, the fact that we suffer, that we lose the things, the people that we care about. We have to see our loved ones die, sometimes die painfully. We have to lose the things that we care about, and we ourselves will ultimately die. And there's just too much. There's too much suffering in the world. There's too much pain in the world to just brush it off with a sort of healthy-mindedness. And he compares it to youth and old age, the hot-headed youth and the hoary eld, and old age has the last word. He says the purely naturalistic look at life, however enthusiastic it may begin, is sure to end in sadness. So that if you just look at life in the material, there's no way that goodness wins, because in the material world you grow old, your body falls apart, and you die. And the things that I've been describing are all true. And if you only look at things in a naturalistic, non-religious way, there is no like true goodness at the end. The story doesn't end well. There's no happy ending. Religion gives us a sort of happy ending. We all go to heaven. We get resurrected. All is well with the world at the end of the day. And in a naturalistic view, you can't necessarily say that all is well at the end of the day. All really breaks apart, crumbles, dies, suffers, and is broken at the end of the day. in his description here. So, but yeah, he says the sadness lies at the heart of every positivistic, agnostic, or naturalistic scheme of philosophy. He says the old man, sick with an insidious internal disease, may laugh and quaff his wine at first, as well as ever, but he knows his fate. The doctors have revealed it, and the knowledge knocks the satisfaction out of all these functions. Knowing that you are going to die, knowing that you're suffering and your suffering will only grow, brings a little bit of the luster off the sort of healthy-minded, deliberate ignorance of the cheerful state of mind. So, moving on, he talks a little bit more about the way the naturalistic view of the world doesn't ultimately satisfy. He says, quote, "For naturalism, fed on recent cosmological speculations, mankind is in a position similar to that of a set of people living on a frozen lake, surrounded by cliffs over which there is no escape, yet knowing that little by little the ice is melting, and the inevitable day drawing near, when the last film of it will disappear, and to be drowned ignominiously will be the human creature's portion. The merrier the skating, the warmer and more sparkling the sun by day, and the ruddier the bonfires at night, the more poignant the sadness with which one must take in the meaning of the total situation." The early Greeks are continually held up to us in literary works as models of the healthy-minded joyousness which the religion of nature may engender. There was indeed much joyousness among the Greeks. Homer's flow of enthusiasm for most things that the sun shines upon is steady. But even in Homer, the reflective passages are cheerless, and the moment the Greeks grew systematically pensive and thought of ultimates, they became unmitigated pessimists. The jealousy of the gods, the nemesis that follows too much happiness, the all-encompassing death, fate's dark opacity, the ultimate and unintelligible cruelty were the fixed background of their imagination. The beautiful joyousness of their polytheism is only a poetic modern fiction. They knew no joys comparable in quality of preciousness to those which we shall ere long see that Brahmins, Buddhists, Christians, Mohammedans, twice-born people whose religion is non-naturalistic, get from their several creeds of mysticism and renunciation. Stoic insensibility and Epicurean resignation were the farthest advance which the Greek mind made in that direction. The Epicureans said, "Seek not to be happy, but rather to escape unhappiness. Strong happiness is always linked with pain, therefore hug the safe shore, and do not tempt the deeper raptures. Avoid disappointment by expecting little, and by aiming low, and above all, do not fret." The Stoic said, "The only genuine good that life can yield a man is the free possession of his own soul. All other goods are lies." Each of these philosophies is, in its degree, a philosophy of despair in nature's boons. Trustful self-abandonment to the joys that freely offer has entirely departed from both Epicurean and Stoic, and what each proposes is a way of rescue from the resultant dust and ashes state of mind. The Epicurean still awaits results from economy of indulgence and damping of desire. The Stoic hopes for no results, and gives up natural good altogether. There is dignity in both these forms of resignation. They represent distinct stages in the sobering process which man's primitive intoxication with sense happiness is sure to undergo. In the one, the hot blood has grown cool, in the other, it has become quite cold. And although I have spoken of them in the past tense, as if they were merely historic, yet Stoicism and Epicureanism will probably be, to all time, typical attitudes, marking a certain definite stage accomplished in the evolution of the world's sick soul. They mark the conclusion of what we call the once-born period, and represent the highest flights of what twice-born religion would call the purely natural man. Epicureanism, which can only by great courtesy be called a religion, showing his refinement, and Stoicism exhibiting his moral will. They leave the world in the shape of an unreconciled contradiction, and seek no higher unity. Compared with the complex ecstasies which the supernaturally regenerated Christian may enjoy, or the Oriental pantheist indulge in, their receipts for equanimity are expedients which seem almost crude in their simplicity. End quote. So it does sort of sound like he's talking smack about Epicureanism and Stoicism here, and about natural religion in general. He says basically those are the highest forms of Greek naturalism that they were able to come up with. He says the idea that they were this happy-go-lucky, the Greeks were this happy-go-lucky people, these optimists, perpetually happy, healthy-minded joyousness. He says that's sort of not really how they lived. Once they really began to think about things a little bit more, their whole philosophy, their tragedy, their poetry, Homer, there's a sort of darkness behind it all. It's an interesting comparison that he makes at the very beginning of that section, where he says that naturalism, especially fed on recent cosmological speculations, by which he's talking about the thought about how the universe unfolds and ultimately its slow drive toward entropy, the fact that in our understanding of the material world, we basically suspect at this point that the high energy of the Big Bang is slowly dwindling and things are evening out, right? This is the law of entropy, the dispersal of energy, and things will slow down, the stars will burn out, and it's not an ongoing, ever perpetuating cycle. It's just that there was a big flash, a bang. I don't want to get into the Big Bang because I don't understand it entirely, and this isn't an episode about physics, but the idea just being that the universe is cooling, the universe is slowing, and the universe is going to end and stop, and there will be nothing more from there. And that's sort of like a group of people living on a frozen lake surrounded by cliffs that they cannot scale, and knowing that over time, slowly, the ice is melting. And ultimately, they're all going to drown. When the last bit of ice melts, they'll all sink into the water, and they'll all drown. And he says that the bonfires, the ice skating, the songs they sing, the things they do, only sort of enhance the sadness that one must have when one takes in the entire situation. And I've talked about this a little bit before, but I'm not so sure that I think that that's necessarily a bad way of looking at the world. There's an underlying sadness to the people who live on the frozen lake, but don't they enjoy their sunny days a little bit more, knowing how temporary they are? And I've thought this for a long time, that don't we sort of value things a little bit more when we know that they're temporary? When you love someone and you know that you have a limited number of days that you'll spend with that person, it's not infinite. Don't you value them a little bit more, and don't you value the time that you spend with them a little bit more? When you know the frozen lake is slowly melting, don't you just enjoy the moment that you have to ice skate a little bit more because of its temporariness? And there may be an underlying sadness in every spin and jump of the ice skates. There's a sadness behind it, but the sadness behind it reinforces the joy of the moment. How could you really enjoy things in the same way if they lasted forever? And it's spoken about, I can't recall which episode, but I think one of the episodes spoke about this in regards to the Greek gods, and how the Greek gods couldn't really appreciate the way mortals savor their lives, the breadth of emotions that mortals experience, the sadness and despair of mortals, the joy of mortals. Gods that live forever can't really experience those things. They can't really fear. They can't really savor things. Everything is just another day in an infinite series of days to the immortal. And, is it the case that the sadness that underlies the melting lake is so profound and so powerful that the people who live on the ice really need to invent something that can give them an escape, that can convince them that the ice isn't really melting, that they won't really ever face the day when they will all drown, or their society, or their civilization, or whatever you wish to call it. Should the ice outlast their own individual lives, the ice won't outlast their civilization. The ice will melt, and their civilization and their society and their little town and their traditions will all end. I wonder whether the sadness and the joy must go hand in hand. And without the sadness and without the temporariness of it all, the joy just cannot be quite so joyful. But I don't know. At any rate, he sort of basically says that there's a limit to how much joy and ecstasy one can experience without eliminating that sad, dark undercurrent. And he says that the Greeks, with the Epicureans and the Stoics, those were sorts of philosophies that were really based on acceptance of this sort of dark background of reality. One saying, don't try for too much, don't seek too much, because don't try to be happy because you will ultimately be disappointed. So be content with little things. He says, avoid disappointment by expecting little, aiming low, and above all, do not fret. The Stoic says, the only genuine good that life can yield a man is the free possession of his own soul. Everything else is a lie. And he says those are sort of basically pessimistic philosophies. There can be no true optimistic philosophy. There can be no true ecstasy in the form that religion gives people, that Christianity gives, or other religions give. He mentions other ones as well, without reaching into the realm of the supernatural. He says, compared with the complex ecstasies which the supernaturally regenerated Christian may enjoy, or the Oriental pantheist indulge in, their receipts for equanimity are expedients which seem almost crude in their simplicity. It just doesn't quite compare to the joy of eternal salvation. And maybe that's the case. But I also wonder whether he really understands Epicureanism or Stoicism entirely. Now he's the famous philosopher, not me. So I suppose I have to assume he understands those things better than I do. I haven't read a tremendous amount about Epicureanism or Stoicism. But at any rate, there's one more section here that I want to read when he talks about the conflict between the healthy-minded state of mind and the sick soul state of mind, where he says, quote, "Were we disposed to open the chapter of really insane melancholia, with its hallucinations and delusions, it would be a worse story still. Desperation, absolute and complete, the whole universe coagulating about the sufferer into a material of overwhelming horror, surrounding him without opening or end. Not the conception or intellectual perception of evil, but the grisly, blood-freezing, heart-palsying sensation of it close upon one, and no other conception or sensation able to live for a moment in its presence. How irrelevantly remote seem all our usual refined optimisms and intellectual and moral consolations in presence of a need of help like this. Here is the real core of the religious problem. Help! Help! No prophet can claim to bring a final message unless he says things that will have a sound of reality in the ears of victims such as these. But the deliverance must come in as strong a form as the complaint if it is to take effect. And that seems a reason why the coarser religions, revivalistic, orgiastic, with blood and miracles and supernatural operations, may possibly never be displaced. Some constitutions need them too much. Arrived at this point, we can see how great an antagonism may naturally arise between the healthy-minded way of viewing life and the way that takes all this experience of evil as something essential. To this latter way, the morbid-minded way, as we might call it, healthy-mindedness, pure and simple, seems unspeakably blind and shallow. To the healthy-minded way, on the other hand, the way of the sick soul seems unmanly and diseased. With their grubbing in rat holes instead of living in the light, with their manufacture of fears and preoccupation with every unwholesome kind of misery, there is something almost obscene about these children of wrath and cravers of a second birth. If religious intolerance and hanging and burning could again become the order of the day, there is little doubt that, however it may have been in the past, the healthy-minded would at present show themselves the less indulgent party of the two. In our own attitude, not yet abandoned, of impartial onlookers, what are we to say of this quarrel? It seems to me that we are bound to say that morbid-mindedness ranges over the wider scale of experience, and that its survey is the one that overlaps. The method of averting one's attention from evil and simply living in the light of good is splendid as long as it will work. It will work with many persons. It will work far more generally than most of us are ready to suppose. And within the sphere of its successful operation, there is nothing to be said against it as a religious solution. But it breaks down impotently as soon as melancholy comes. And even though one might be quite free from melancholy oneself, there is no doubt that healthy-mindedness is inadequate as a philosophical doctrine, because the evil facts which it refuses positively to account for are a genuine portion of reality, and they may, after all, be the best key to life's significance, and possibly the only openers of our eyes to the deepest levels of truth. The normal process of life contains many moments as bad as any of those which insane melancholy is filled with. Moments in which radical evil gets its innings and takes its solid turn. The lunatic's vision of horror are all drawn from the material of daily fact. Our civilization is founded on the shambles, and every individual existence goes out in a lonely spasm of helpless agony. If you protest, my friend, wait till you arrive there yourself. To believe in the carnivorous reptiles of geologic times is hard for our imagination. They seem too much like mere museum specimens. Yet there is no tooth in any one of those museum skulls that did not daily, through long years of the foretime, hold fast to the body struggling in despair of some fated living victim. Forms of horror just as dreadful to their victims, if, on a smaller spatial scale, fill the world about us today. Here, on our very hearths and in our gardens, the infernal cat plays with the panting mouse, or holds the hot bird fluttering in her jaws. Crocodiles and rattlesnakes and pythons are at this moment vessels of life as real as we are. Their loathsome existence fills every minute of every day that drags its length along, and whenever they or other wild beasts clutch their living prey, the deadly horror which an agitated melancholiac feels is the literal right reaction on the situation. It may indeed be that no religious reconciliation with the absolute totality of things is possible. Some evils, indeed, are ministerial to higher forms of good, but it may be that there are forms of evil so extreme as to enter into no good system whatsoever, and that, in respect of such evil, dumb submission or neglect to notice is the only practical resource. This question must confront us on a later day, but provisionally, and as a mere matter of program and method, since the evil facts are as genuine part of nature as the good ones, the philosophic presumption should be that they have some rational significance, and that systematic healthy-mindedness, failing as it does to accord to sorrow, pain, and death any positive and active attention whatever, is formally less complete than systems that try at least to include these elements in their scope. End quote. So here he just sort of weighs the two against one another, and he starts with this kind of powerful and gripping description of the insane melancholiac, the paranoid schizophrenic, perhaps. And this section, it's powerful. It's a powerful section. He says in this section that were we disposed to look at melancholia, it would be a terrible story, desperation, absolute and complete, the whole universe coagulating about the sufferer into a material of overwhelming horror, surrounding him without opening or end, not the conception or intellectual perception of evil, but the grisly, blood-freezing, heart-palsying sensation of it, close upon one, and no other conception or sensation able to live for a moment in its presence. So people just experiencing the worst terrible terror, fear, horror, suffering all the time inside their minds. The greatest sadness, perhaps, the deepest depression, or the most blood-curdling paranoia of evil, and it's kind of mind-blowing in this sort of terrible insanity of a malevolent schizophrenia. And he says, here's the real core of the religious problem. Help. He says that the usual optimisms and moral consolations are useless for such people. And he says that the coarser religions may never be displaced because such constitutions need them too much. And religion is really a way for such people to not totally drown in their suffering. Sometimes there are people who just aren't able to have the healthy-minded, happy-go-lucky approach. They need something more in order to make it through their suffering lives. The power of positive thinking is wholly inadequate to the suffering, and not only just in suffering of insanity, but people whose lives truly are suffering, people who have debilitating, painful diseases, especially before the advent of modern medicine, when life was really suffering for many people. The healthy-mindedness just sort of seems like a pale, weak, useless tool for such people. They need something more in order to make it through their lives. And I suppose that's really where the more supernatural, everlasting life, the rewards after death, that your life is suffering, but if you believe in God and devote yourself, your afterlife, you will get your rewards, and it will be a world of pleasure, in contrast to the life of pain that you have lived here in the world. One can certainly see the appeal. On the flip side, he does say that to the healthy-minded, the ways of the sick soul seem unmanly and diseased, grubbing in rat holes instead of living in the light, manufacturing fears, preoccupied with every sort of unwholesome misery. There's something obscene about such mindset, and that if we were hanging and burning and we had the religious tolerance today that once existed in the past, that the healthy-minded people would be the less indulgent, would be the less inclined to hang the witches and burn the witches and persecute the non-believers. The healthy-minded would probably be a little bit more coherent. So there's upsides to the healthy-minded approach, and there are downsides. And he says that ultimately the evil that exists in the world is real. He says the lunatic's vision of horror are all drawn from the material of daily fact. There are moments in life when evil gets its innings, when evil takes its turn. It's not all make-believe. Much of it is very real, right? Evil in the world is real. Suffering and harming other people in just mind-bogglingly evil ways. It's all things that are not just the invention of story, but are things that happen in the world, and right down to the nature of the suffering of the mouse being eaten by the cat. If you ever see videos online, as sometimes I have, of animals killing and eating other animals, you're really looking at living creatures that are able to suffer and feel pain, being eaten alive. It's hard to imagine anything quite as terrifying and painful and filled with suffering as being eaten alive by a predator. And yet this happens in your garden, probably, and all over the face of the earth in the animal kingdom. And sometimes happens to people if they aren't careful. And on that, he says basically that some form of recognition of these evils is necessary for a complete view of the world. And insofar as healthy-mindedness deliberately blocks these sorts of things from their field of vision, it remains incomplete. So what to do with this state of affairs, we will examine next episode when I continue on with the latter portion of the book. Thank you very much for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.